So often conversations like this one start with a theology, right? Or abstract principles. But today, we're not going to do that. We're going to start with people. Because when it comes to the debate over faith, sexuality, and the church, the cost of being wrong, well, it's measured in human lives. So let's really dive into the real-world impact of these teachings and ask a tough question. Is there a more faithful way forward? Just look at this number for a second. 40%. Up to 40% of all homeless youth in America identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. I mean, that's nearly half. And the truly tragic reality here is that so many of them, they were pushed out of their own homes, often because of religiously motivated rejection from their families. And it gets even more heartbreaking. There's a direct, measurable link between that rejection and self-harm. I mean, the research is pretty clear on this. LGBT youth who feel rejected by their families are 8.4 times more likely to attempt suicide compared to those who are accepted. This isn't just a sad coincidence. It's a direct consequence. And this next number, well, it points to the long-term damage. It connects directly to something health experts call adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs for short. Think about it. When certain church teachings lead to family rejection or ongoing emotional abuse, what they're actually doing is creating high ACE scores. And the data shows that young people with those high scores are over 12 times more likely to attempt suicide. It's a public health crisis that really starts as a theological one. It's so important to remember every single one of these statistics, that's somebody's child, someone created in the image of God. So when a particular teaching leads directly to things like depression, homelessness, and even suicide, we have to stop. We just have to pause and ask ourselves a really hard question. Because the cost of being wrong here isn't just some abstract theological error. It's a full-blown human catastrophe. So here's the crucial point. Jesus himself actually gave us a test for this kind of thing. He said you'll know a tree by its fruit. So if the fruit of a particular teaching is this much pain, this much devastation, can we honestly, hand on heart, say the tree itself is good, that it's from God? This is the central question we're going to explore as we take a much closer look at the biblical texts themselves. All right, now, before we can really challenge an interpretation, we have to make sure we understand it fairly. I think that's only right. And look, many sincere, good-hearted Christians believe the Bible's teaching on this is totally clear, consistent, and absolute. So let's start there. Let's lay out the strongest version of that traditional argument. Okay, so the argument really stands on a few key pillars. It all starts back in Genesis, right? The creation story. God makes Adam and Eve, and that male-female model is seen as the fundamental blueprint for all marriage, a pattern that even Jesus himself refers to later on. Then you have these specific prohibitions, like the ones in Leviticus, in Paul's letters in the New Testament. And these are generally read as universal, timeless condemnations of any and all same-sex relationships. For a lot of people, that's it. That's the final word. But what if I told you there's this powerful precedent deep in church history for re-examining a biblical prohibition that was once considered just as clear, just as absolute, and just as non-negotiable? Yeah, let's talk about the pretty much forgotten story of usury. Now, when we hear the word usury today, our minds probably jump to loan sharks, right? People charging these outrageous, insane interest rates, but that's not actually the biblical meaning. For thousands of years, usury just meant charging any interest at all on a loan. And the Bible, well, it condemned it in the strongest possible terms. Just take a look at the language here. It's pretty much identical. For both male same-sex relations and for charging interest, the Bible uses the exact same Hebrew word for detestable, or abomination, and it gives the exact same penalty, death. In fact, some of the early church fathers even called usury a practice that was against nature. Does that phrase sound at all familiar? So, what happened? How did we get from there to here? Well, for over 1,500 years, the church was completely united against usury. Then, in the 16th century, the famous reformer John Calvin looked at the world changing around him. Cities and commerce were booming, and he made a new argument. He said the real principle behind the rule was about preventing the exploitation of the poor, not banning all interest forever. He was the one who made that key distinction between exploitative loans and productive ones. And today, every single Christian I know participates in this reinterpreted system, whether it's through a mortgage, a student loan, or even just a simple savings account. The church literally changed its mind, all based on a deeper reading of Scripture in a new context. So this whole story about usury,
It gives us a model. It shows us that faithfully re-examining Scripture isn't some new radical idea. It's actually part of our tradition. So with that in mind, let's try to apply that same careful, thoughtful lens to those key passages, the ones often called the clobber passages, that are used to condemn same-sex relationships.
And this, of course, is the big question, isn't it? It's the slippery slope argument. People worry, if we reinterpret this, where does it stop? If we change our minds here, does everything just become relative? Does this somehow lead to affirming things like polygamy or even something awful like pedophilia? And you know what? That's a serious and a valid concern, and it absolutely deserves a serious answer.
Well, the answer isn't to just abandon all principles. It's about identifying the right principles, the deeper ones. And if you look across the entire arc of Scripture, you see a consistent theme. God blesses relationships that are built on these pillars of consent, mutuality, equality, and a faithful covenant. That's our guardrail. And just as consistently, the Bible condemns relationships that are defined by the opposites: coercion, exploitation, abuse. So when you look at it that way, loving, committed, monogamous same-sex relationships fit squarely in that first category. And the other exploitative practices we mentioned, they clearly fit in the second. Okay, here's a fact that surprises most people when they first hear it. The word homosexual did not appear in any English Bible translation until 1946. 1946. Before that, the original Greek words that Paul used, well, they were rare, and their exact meaning is still debated by scholars. But they most likely pointed to specific exploitative acts that were common back in the Greco-Roman world. Things like pederasty, which was the horrible abuse of young boys by older men, or maybe temple prostitution. The point is, these terms were describing abusive and transactional acts, not a person's sexual orientation or a committed, loving relationship like we think of today. And let's not forget the most important voice in all of this. In all of his teachings, in everything we have recorded, Jesus never once mentioned this topic. Not a single time. His ministry was consistently, relentlessly focused on lifting up the marginalized, on challenging religious hypocrisy, and on centering love and justice for the very people that society had thrown away. So, all of this, it brings us right back to where we started, full circle. We began with that devastating human cost, the bad fruit that comes from the traditional teaching. So now, let's apply the test that Jesus himself gave us. Let's apply it directly. These are his own words. It's such a pragmatic, real-world test for any teaching, any theology, any doctrine. He's basically asking, what is the actual, tangible result in people's lives? Does it produce nourishment and life, like grapes and figs? Or does it produce thorns and pain? And when you apply that test, the contrast is, well, it's stark. On one side, you have the documented results of non-affirming theology, staggering rates of depression, suicide, homelessness, families literally torn apart, and people losing their faith. And on the other side, well, you see the fruit that comes from committed, loving, same-sex relationships, and it aligns almost perfectly with the fruit of the Spirit that the Apostle Paul talks about in Galatians, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, self-control. And that's the crucial takeaway here. This kind of re-examination, it isn't about throwing out the Bible. Not at all. It's about digging deeper. It's about choosing a reading that actually aligns with the bigger, overarching biblical themes of love and liberation. It's about finding an interpretation that produces the good fruit Jesus told us to look for. In that sense, it's a profound act of faithfulness, not an act of rebellion. So ultimately, this leaves every one of us and every one of our communities with a really profound challenge. When we look at the lives being impacted by our theology, when we look at the real-world results of what we teach and practice, what is our harvest? Is it a harvest of life and flourishing, or is it a harvest of suffering? The answer to that question, well, it might just be the most faithful guide we have.